Epistemology, I believe, would be better glossed by saying it means a theory of scientific experience. So, not just any theory of experience, but experiences which lead to knowledge. Science and knowledge are the same thing. Um, so that looked at on analogy with any culture, although we have this meta difficulty that the concept of culture itself comes out of one culture, looked at from this difficulty, from this ground, we can then say the Western universalism springs from philosophy, which becomes metaphysics, which becomes ontology as a general ontology set off against psychology, the problem of God being evil, or one could almost say agathon or agathos being evil, which is totally contradictory. Although when we look at it through, as a side path, when we look at that through the analysis of the book of Genesis or so, we can come up with certain answers for that, in Leo Strauss, for example. But, and the problem of cosmology, so that cosmology, psychology in the Platonic sense as a legal theory basically of action, what motivates action of human beings, and theodicy, or the problem of evil, become the special regional ontologies under the system of Wolff and his followers, Christian Wolff, who was apparently reacting to Descartes, as I mentioned in the earlier video. That then becomes, in our own time, ontology as set off against, basically as set off against scientific method. Different theories of scientific method is the real meaning of epistemology. So, taken that way, we can say Zizek is moving in that tradition, and then he says there's these other people that have a radically different beginning point, so different that we can't fit it into our system at all, but we can only say they really believe. So that's Islamists or Muslims. In this sense, the question comes in, is Zizek some kind of mega racist? So that he has to say, if what I'm saying, the atheist view of a certain, so there's a certain tact in universalism, which would have to be made very specific, how so far as Zizek influenced by his training at the École Normale Supérieure and the French version of Les Athées, which we could then compare to something like Scandinavian Les Athées, or the so-called, somebody has made an independent analysis of what the sort of an anthropology of the Scandinavian norms, and called it the laws of Jante, Jante, which is fairly interesting. But you could compare different things like that and say, what does this atheism really mean? What's this, the specific intangible meaning of it? But in any case, this kind of universalism, which corresponds to universal human rights and to everything Schmitt said about the war of the humans against the non-humans and so forth, we can see Zizek is radically rejecting Islam as not fitting into this. There's somebody came out with some paper called the, not just a paper, but some officials in some ways came out with a statement of the Islamic Code of Universal Human Rights or something like that, in order to say human rights can't be only dictated by Roosevelt or by the Atlanticists or whosoever. But that then is something like, basically, we don't want to look, we want to fit in with the world norms and how the people in power are doing things. We don't want to look foolish. We want to be in the most approved style. Therefore, we come out with these statements in order to, in a way, placate the West. But that's not the bottom. If you really want to know what Islam's about, you can't really go to the people that are presenting this world normative legal Islam in that sense. perhaps. But if you go to the people that are the real believers and have a sort of a living tie, like Plato says, of the like the fire leaping from branch to branch, from student to or from teacher to student over many generations. So there's a living teaching. I think you'll get from these imams or these mufti a different version of Islam, which is corresponding to the one Zizek's radically rejecting. And then, so this opens a question which we could analyze in greater detail by thinking about the root of our own tradition in this move, apparently from either poetry or mythos to logos, or what the philosophers think is better. So these are well-known subject matter, but I just want to interject that there's a certain amount of ambiguity there between whether Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, what are they breaking from? Because with Aristotle, it's more practical. He's just saying we were kind of cut off from our tradition when the policies rose, and you got these rich families, and they started taking advantage of people, and then you needed Draco and Plato's ancestor Solon to come in and publicly promulgate law. Aristotle seems to be more oriented towards these practical problems of the recent centuries of Athenian history, and towards producing constitutions accordingly, as he's famous for. Whereas in Socrates and Plato, we have this one contact with the rhapsodes as the singers of Homer. We get this certain, I just mentioned as an aside, we have this Milman Perry school, which was actually in Albania, where they had living rhapsodes studying it. Empirically, what happens is, according to their claim, is that you have something they call Homeric Iliad, rather than the Iliad actually produced by one guy named Homer, because the rhapsodes, who sort of correspond a little bit to the medieval troubadours, have in the course of their performance ad-libbed many times over the centuries, to such an extent that you can't really say this thing is composed by one person named Homer. So they talk about Homeric Iliad. So then we have this text, which is in some way a hodgepodge of different centuries, which then Socrates and Plato especially are looking over and saying this is whether we can accept these myths, this mythos, or whether we have to supersede it with the logos and with conscious reasoning or something like that, with the so-called Platonic dialectic. But on the other hand, is mythos exactly the same as poetry, in this sense that the rhapsode is inspired and he doesn't really understand what he's saying? There's a specific theory about that, but then there's also what I was just trying to analogize this to, is this notion of cult made tangible. So is the Homeric Iliad really cult for the archaic Greeks? It's not exactly the same thing as cult. Cult is more primitive. It contains cultic episodes. It contains very primitive episodes, such as the trial of Paris, of the choosing of the goddesses, which is then you could see how it loses its seriousness and becomes a subject of ridicule in the classical period, in the period of Aristotle and so on, or the 200 years prior to the Plato and Socrates. But if we push back to cult, to the sort of the Ursprung, then this question arises: why can't there be other Ursprungs which don't lead to this sort of iron cage, this Weberian iron cage, or something like that, the atheism of Zizek, or the atheism of Zizek, which may be very different from Weber's picture, but does everything out of this 0 point have to arise in the same way, such that Zizek can say um, we're at unparalleled risk of uh, losing everything that we've gained because there's these people who really believe, because maybe their life is flowing out of that earth source in some other way, such that their cult becomes tangible. Um, Remembering that when I say a cult become tangible, that's a specific um, way of representing what's happening, which happens within our tradition, and which we've, as it were, as part of the historical deposit which we've received, and therefore one way to say what's happened, which might be given, which may be therefore skewed, and only a mirror, which is our mirror. Um, so just to remember, this concept of the mirrors is like Mishima has said, Japan was forced to look through the mirror of the Americans twice, once when Commodore Perry broke in to open the commercial trade, and another time in World War II. And through doing this, there was a radical change in the character of the Japanese, where they ceased to be Japanese and became a culture.